asks, "Is there a word from the Lord?" Jeremiah responds, "If I tell you the worst thing that you're going to do to me is you won't listen, or the best thing you would do to me is not listen to me. The worst thing is that you would kill me." Zedekiah vows, "I will not hurt you, I will not kill you." Jeremiah, as we saw, gives the exact same word that he gave time and time and time again. You notice in verse 19, as I already mentioned, what Zedekiah's fear was. Why was it that he did not want to surrender or give himself over to the Babylonians? It says that he was afraid of the Jews lest they would mock him. And that word mock simply means to make fun of. It could have a little bit more detail to it, as in mock him, as in treat him shamefully, kill him, or do something of that nature. But he basically is saying, I'm afraid of my own people lest they mock me, lest they make fun of me or treat me badly. That really is an insight into a man's heart. And Zedekiah was an ungodly king. He was an ungodly man. But as I read that and as I think about the times that he sought after learning and knowing what God said, my heart really goes out to him in many cases. But he just was not willing to obey. He was not willing to follow what God said. He was living in disobedience. He may have had an inclination towards God or a slight desire about God, and yet he was unwilling to put it to the test. He was unwilling to follow. Jeremiah says in verse 20, "If you obey, it will be well for you." The same is true for us. If we obey the Lord, it will be well for us. Often we are fearful that our obedience to God is going to bring problems. We think about, if I obey God in this area, we have a list of issues or problems that may come as a result of that obedience. A parent may say, I'm going to live in righteousness and my children are going to live in righteousness, but maybe they're fearful of the children's response or reaction to that. And they may fear, I really can't keep that on forever. It's too hard to live a pure life. Or, as a spouse, I'm going to commit to love my spouse. I'm going to apologize for the areas that I have fallen short, but I'm fearful that I'll make the same mistake again and they'll throw that back in my face. And often we're very fearful of where obedience to God will land us and where it will bring us. Can I say that obedience to God always brings God's blessings? Obedience to the Lord and to His Word will always be right. Disobedience to God is where we find problems. Now, obedience to God may not always turn out how you want it. We have in our mind, okay, if I obey in this area, it's going to be this as a result. It may not be that, but obedience will always be right. Obedience is always best as we follow and as we seek the Lord. Zedekiah refuses in verse 21. If he refuses, as we saw, what he feared would come upon him. The women of his house, his concubines, would mock him. His wives and his children would be brought out to the Chaldeans. Later we'll see what happens to his sons. He would not escape and the city would be destroyed. There are always consequences to our disobedience. You cannot disobey God and not face consequences. Even as you study the book of Proverbs, just the basic wisdom of life, God always attaches consequences to disobedience or to foolishness. And we have to be careful to realize that our decisions and our obedience or disobedience will bring consequences. Sadly, many times it leads to problems for our spouse as we disobey, or to our children, our family, or our church. Will you not spare your family from the heartache, and will you follow God? Will you make it a point and a commitment in your life, I'm going to follow God, whether it makes sense, whether I want to or not, I'm going to follow God with all my heart. In verse number 24 down through 28, an agreement is made between Zedekiah and Jeremiah. And Jeremiah promises that if the princes come to him and ask what they talked about, he would simply say, I petitioned the king that he would not allow me to go back to the dungeon so I don't die. And that's exactly what Jeremiah did. Now, we have covered 2 chapters. And we covered 2 chapters in order to get to this 3rd chapter. All right, so that was all a lot of good background information, and it was a neat story. But we want to put it to work. We want to put it into practice for us of what does that apply to us. Because if you look at those 2 chapters and you didn't have chapter 39, you could walk away and possibly say, well, those are all great and good, but, Zedekiah, he looks like he's doing fine at this point. Jeremiah looks like he's the one in trouble, right? Jeremiah is in the court of a prison at the very best. He had just come out of the dungeon, out of a hole. The king, at least, has food and he's doing pretty well. When we get to chapter 39, we see everything break open. And we really see, ultimately, the consequences of disobedience as well as obedience. All throughout the book, Jeremiah gives the same warnings, that if you stay in the city, you'll die. If you give yourself up to the Chaldeans, you will live. It's the same message he had preached for years. The Chaldeans had been coming in waves, 605 BC, 597 BC, and now in 586 BC. It's going backwards because it's BC, you understand. Didn't want to throw anybody off there, but you're going backwards, okay? So, and now they've got BCE. Have you guys noticed that? When they record history and it's BCE or CE, amazingly enough, it's the same as if it was before Christ or after Christ, but now it's the common era and before the common era. It's just another way for them to get Christ out of everything. But it's 586 BC, all right? So the time is coming when the city of Jerusalem is going to be given over. But Jeremiah had preached and been faithful for years. He preached the same message to multiple kings. He preached it to Jehoiakim, to Jeconiah, now to Zedekiah, to all of these kings, and yet none of them listened. Chapter 39, in its basic sense, is the gathering together of much of the book. In very plain terms, we see the result of obedience and disobedience. And again, it goes hand in hand with our morning message. But in this passage, let's first look at the consequences of disobedience. Jeremiah chapter 39, look at verse 1 down through 10. It says, "In the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army against Jerusalem, and they besieged it. And in the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 4th month," that's a year and a half later from verse 1, "the 9th day of the month, the city was broken up. And all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate, even," and then you've got lots of names. Verse number 4, "And it came to pass that when Zedekiah," those are hard names, by the way. Nergal-Sharezer, that's a tough one. But verse 4, it says, "And it came to pass that when Zedekiah, the king of Judah, saw them and all the men of war, then they fled and went forth out of the city by night." So they had been besieged, and now the city is being broken into. Now the king and the men of war flee. "And by the way of the king's garden, by the gate betwixt or between the two walls, and he went out the way of the plain. But the Chaldeans' army pursued after them and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho. When they had taken him, they brought him up to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to Riblah in the land of Hamath." This is in Syria, so a number of miles north, "where Nebuchadnezzar gave judgment upon him," Zedekiah. "Then the king of Babylon," and note verse 6, "then the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah in Riblah before Zedekiah's eyes. Also the king of Babylon slew all the nobles of Judah. Moreover, he put out Zedekiah's eyes and bound him with chains to carry him to Babylon. And the Chaldeans burned the king's house and the houses of the people with fire and brake down the walls of Jerusalem. Then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive into Babylon the remnant of the people that remained in the city and those that fell away, that fell to him, with the rest of the people that remained. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left of the poor of the people, which had nothing, in the land of Judah, and gave them vineyards and fields at the same time." As you read verses 1 through 10, if you wanted to later in chapter 52, you have the record of the same story, a little bit fuller of a treatment, but in chapter 52 we have the same story as recorded here. Verse number 1 describes the beginning of the siege. A year and a half later, in verse number 2, in 586, the siege ends. And if you are studying Old Testament, the year 586 is probably, BC, is probably the most important, if not one of the most important dates in Jewish history. Almost unequivocally, it's the most important date of the Old Testament. 586 BC, because it was a major turning point. It was when the Babylonian captivity begins, but it's also a period of turning for the entire nation. After 586, the children of Israel will never again struggle with idolatry. They will never again, like they had in previous years for the past 500 years struggle with idols and Baal,